Now let's speak about the institutional arrangements in Australian education policy. So when we speak about institutional arrangements in education policy, we are really thinking about some key issues such as who is responsible for funding education, who provides and delivers education, who gets to determine the content of the curriculum, and who gets even to assess what is good enough education, and even questions of quality assurance broadly fall under the debates which really informs different layers of responsibilities and institutional arrangements for our education systems. Other important issues relate to the relationship between education and future opportunities for students, as well as the economy. So this is where comes the next layer of the broader goals of education. In the previous recording, we briefly spoke about, the ongoing debates around what education should aim to achieve as part of, the reasons why, education is such a contested policy area. But another layer of that debate can be around the type of skills we really want to give our children who attend different school systems. And, these debates can be informed to what, as a society, we really feel we need the most. Do we need more engineers than more medical staff? Do we need more nurses than more, I don't know, social workers? Do we need more people trained in, soft skills and so on and so forth? So the backdrop to education policy in Australia is really quite complex. And this again speaks to the multiplicity of actors and the dozens of school systems which Hinz referred to in the previous recording. We spoke about this. So, broadly speaking, the education system in Australia involves a wide range of actors, which can be categorized in three major categories. One of them is government-run schools, which are mostly operated by state and territory. And then we also have schools which are operated by the Catholic education system and other schools which are known as independent education system, which usually includes other religious private schools and non-denominational private schools. And again, all these get to participate in the ongoing debate. And each of these different school systems has its own competing agendas and ways to deliver education and what they see they should prioritize. So we also have state and territory governments acting as delivery bodies, while the Commonwealth government always plays a major role as a funding body. And again, each with its own agendas. So, as you can imagine, school system and the education policy in Australia is quite, informed by the politics of the country, really. And the contemporary education policy is shaped by, a decision which was made back in the 1970s, before even Australia became a federation. So that decision established secular state-administered public schools, essentially excluding religious schools from the public system, and tried to, lead to the development of the private school system. So in a sense, this division between public and private school remains visible today. And you still see many schools identifying as either private or public, and both having different arrangements, including arrangements around whether kids have to pay school fees or not, or even the amount of fees which can be paid to children. So another important historical event for education policy in Australia is the Australian Constitution. Education is listed as a residual or unlisted responsibility of the state, and territory governments in the Australian Constitution. So this means that the states and territories have the capacity to operate and to deliver schooling. They generally have fewer financial resources than the federal government, even when we understand that, they are the ones really actually in charge. So this in itself really leads to, ongoing debates about who should fund what and how much for each type of school should be funded by the federal government or the state. So we also have to reiterate that, again, schools in Australia, and when we are speaking about education policy, we are primarily thinking about primary schools and secondary school. But we also recognize that other schools or other forms of education exist, including early childhood education and care, but also post-secondary education, which might include university, technical and vocational education. Things like TAFE won't fall under secondary or primary school. So these are the two broader sectors we are thinking of when speaking about education policy in the context of this course. So, and again, as we said, government will have their own primary and secondary schools, but also non-government schools. We also have non-government or private actors having, and even church or, faith-based structures like the Catholic Church having their own schools which they run. And each state and territory, as we said again, is responsible for giving accreditations to these private schools within their respective jurisdictions. Just a brief snapshot of how many kids attend each school. The most recent figures from 2024 actually indicates that more students actually are enrolled in government schools. That's over 64.4, and then followed by less than 20 only which are enrolled in Catholic schools, and more or less enrolled in private or independent schools. So this entails that there is a coexistence again of the private and public actors in the education system, but also there are, these schools, both for the private and for the public ones, will be functioning differently. Some of them will have day schools, others will have boarding houses, and so on and so forth. But also we still also recognize the existence of specialized education, like education for children with disabilities, or education which focuses on specific area of the education system. So when we talk about the responsibility for education and education policy, this responsibility is shared between the federal and the state governments. I think the first few slides very much acknowledge this. So the states and territory are constitutionally responsible for providing schooling for all school-aged children, and they develop education policy and legislation for their respective jurisdictions. So for example, here in Queensland, Education Queensland is the department responsible for policy, legislation, delivery, and even registration and regulation of schools and teachers. The Queensland government provides the majority of the funding, in this case, for public schools, similar to other states and other territories in Queensland. So states and territories also provide some supplementary funding to the Catholic Church-run school and other independent schools, along with some generalist support services that both public and private schools use. But again, as I said, the majority of the funding, for government schools are probably coming from, the federal government, and supplementary funding for the Catholic and independent schools are given by the state. And there is support used by both private and public, which comes from the state level. So, turning now to the federal government level, the Australian Education Act of 2013 is, the key legislation in this area, and it really outlines the federal government's responsibilities, and responsibilities in particular regarding the funding, and recognizing again and acknowledging very much that majority of the funding for non-government schools will be, run by the state and territories. And again, this is again an ongoing debate on to how much non-government actors like private schools can be charging school children attending those schools. So importantly, the federal government does not directly provide schooling outside of primary and secondary school levels. It has other responsibilities such as regulation and support of early childhood education, tertiary education, and even some international education rules. So if education will remain free as long as you are attending, high school and primary school. But when it comes to university level, or even if you need to take your child to daycare, those ones will tend to make you pay. So increasingly, we are seeing a national approach to education policy, which is being negotiated between the states, territory, and the federal government. And previously, these negotiations, happened through the Council of the Australian Government, the COAJ, which he was in charge for many years. But since 2020, we have seen some changes in the National Cabinet for Education. And at the national level, this resulted in agreements about a national curriculum, and a few other arrangements which came to influence, how assessments of children can be conducted, and things like that. And again, this speaks to the ongoing debate between different actors involved in Australian education. I think we'll discuss more about this in the next few workbooks, and we'll discuss why demographic data and socioeconomic disadvantage measures are important for funding, and why government gets to fund some schools probably and not others, or why do they get to fund some schools to some extent and not the same level as they fund others. So to close here, some key departments and organizations involved in the education system and delivery in Queensland in particular. So as we said, at the federal level, the Australian Government Department of Education plays a crucial role, not only in the funding, but also in making sure that the education is meeting the standards we want as a nation. So the Australian Curriculum and Assessment and Reporting Authority, known as the ACARA, is responsible for the national plan and reporting student demographics, which informs funding models. So again, at the state level, the Queensland's Government Department of Education is responsible for funding and delivering government schools. And the Queensland Curriculum and Assessment Authority is in charge of designing the curriculum for Queensland schools, working collaboratively with ACRA and all the other agents which are involved, or the other partners for education. So in the next module, we shall be now looking in details as onto how schools are funded and the funding system. And we shall be looking at a few other topics before the end of this workbook. Thank you very much.